Good evening. Welcome. I'm Mariana Siciliano, Managing Educator for Public Programs and Creative Practice here at the Met. It is really such a pleasure to see you all here tonight. I am delighted to welcome you to our program, Secrets of the Tudor Archives, presented in conjunction with the exhibition, The Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England, which just opened last week and is on view until January 8th in Gallery 899. The exhibition traces the transformation of the arts in Tudor England through more than 100 objects, including iconic portraits, spectacular tapestries, manuscripts, sculpture, and armor, both from the Met collection and international lenders. The exhibition is organized by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Cleland Museum of Art in collaboration with the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. We're grateful to our donors who have made this exhibition possible. Alice Carey Brown and W.L. Lyons Brown, Frank Richardson and Kimba Wood, Barbara A. Wolfe, the Diane Carroll Brandt Fund, the Kobe Foundation, the Klesch Collection, Anne M. Spruill, and Daniel H. Cantwell, and Sharon Wee and Tracy Fu. This exhibition is supported by an indemnity from the Federal Council on the Arts and the Humanities. Tonight's program will explore artists including Hans Holbein and Nicholas Hilliard, who have created so many iconic images of the Tudors that we're familiar with today. We'll gain insight into some recent discoveries in British archives that have transformed our understanding of these artists and their royal sitters. We're excited to begin tonight's program with an introduction to the exhibition by Elizabeth Cleland, Curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Met, who co-organized the exhibition with Adam Eaker, Associate Curator in the Department of European Paintings. After Elizabeth's presentation, Adam will be joined on stage by Elizabeth Goldring, whom we're thrilled to have with us this evening. Elizabeth Goldring was born in Washington, D.C., but for the past 25 years has lived in the UK, where she is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and an honorary reader at the University of Warwick Center for the Study of the Renaissance. An expert on 16th and early 17th century British court culture, Dr. Goldring has written and edited several critically acclaimed books on the Tudors. The most recent is Nicholas Hilliard, Life of an Artist, published in 2019, which is an illustrated biography of Queen Elizabeth I's favorite portrait painter. Hilliard was awarded the prestigious Apollo Prize in 2019. We happen to have the book available in our main store, so please do feel free to check that out after the program tonight. Dr. Goldring has been interviewed about the Tudors for a number of television and radio programs, including the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are? And Lucy Worsley's Fireworks for a Tudor Queen. She has also advised several museums on displays relating to Tudor art, and in addition, she regularly reviews new books on all things Tudor for a wide range of publications, including the Burlington Magazine, the Literary Review, the Spectator, and the TLS. Current work in progress includes a new book on Hans Holbein the Younger, court painter to Henry VIII. We're delighted to have our speakers with us this evening. To begin our program, please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Cleland to the stage.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much, Mariana, for that lovely introduction. Our exhibition covers the long 16th century in England, when a Welsh family, the Tudors, held the English throne for 118 years, 3 generations, 5 monarchs, 1485 to 1603. As Mariana mentioned, I'm a curator in the museum's Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, and under my purview comes the post-medieval European textiles. Above all, I love tapestries. So my gateway to this period was very much these gorgeous European and English textiles that the Tudors loved. And just to give you a hint of that, you can see on the left of the screen a detail of Henry VIII's burning of the books tapestries. You can see it upstairs for real. And that was imported to London from Brussels in Flanders, the great center of tapestry weaving. And on the right, though, a British needlework, heavy with precious metal-wrapped thread. That's a detail of the gorgeous bearing cloth upstairs in the Tisch galleries. And it's actually a piece which is from our own collection, because as Mariana mentioned, at the core of this loan exhibition are actually 28 pieces from the Met's permanent holdings. As Adam and I have said, maybe that was what made us audacious enough to think we could tackle the subject of art at the Tudor courts. As Mariana mentioned, my excellent collaborator and co-curator, Adam Eaker, is a curator in the Met's European Paintings department. And I think it's fair to say, you'd probably agree with me, that it's portraits like these which are really what are so evocative for a lot of people when they think of the Tudors. You can see fantastic examples. Again, these are all upstairs on view in Tisch. From the National Portrait Gallery, that incredible portrait of Henry VII. In the center, the Thyssen-Bornemisza's portrait of Henry VIII, and that is the one autograph work by Hans Holbein of Henry VIII. And then beside them, that incredible Hans Eweth view of Mary I, lent to us from the Society of Antiquaries. So for our exhibition about the Tudors, we pulled our curatorial expertise. I coming from the decorative arts standpoint and Adam from the paintings, because we really felt that it was so important to present a fully rounded display of all the arts that the Tudors loved and surrounded themselves with. Of course, these fantastic paintings, but setting them within their historical milieu, because the Tudors spent so much money on glorious textiles, on goldsmiths' work, on manuscripts, on arms and armor, on jewelry. The list goes on, and if you go upstairs, you can see what I mean. And within that presentation of this sort of fully rounded idea of all the arts on view in the Tudor courts, we've also worked hard to engage with a series of themes. First among them, I think you'll probably agree, is the idea of England's outreach on the global stage. For trade, but also for collecting. As the number of European artists represented in the show reflects, there is, of course, a relationship with Europe, something of an ebb and flow depending on the political temperature within England, but also beyond Europe, to Africa, to India, to China. In addition, gender issues. Well, obviously, first and foremost amongst the very powerful women represented within the exhibition is Elizabeth I herself. But really, our show is punctuated by a series of intriguing and interesting female patrons, collectors, artists, and so forth. And as you can see here, so on the far right, we have the formidable Lady Dacre represented by Hans Eweth, or the young independent heiress Constance Luckner, who commissions Flemish weavers to create this extraordinary table carpet, celebrating her own lineage. Bess of Hardwick, of course, we have both her incredible sea dog table and also the portrait she commissioned of Elizabeth I to hang in her splendid new home, Hardwick Hall. And even going back a little earlier, Mary Tudor, Mary, sometimes called Mary Rose in the literature, that's Henry VIII's little sister, who risks her brother's wrath by eloping with her lover and Henry's best friend, Charles Branson. And you can see here the Book of Hours, which Mary re-gifted to Henry VIII in an effort at reconciliation with him. And in addition, we also explore stylistic roots, ending with asking, why does Elizabethan art look the way it does? Because there is no doubt that by the time we get to the end of the Tudor period, there's a total rejection of the sort of standard and conventional European ideals of aesthetic beauty for something really quirky and idiosyncratic, and dare I say it, even slightly odd. And I have here this glorious array of works in a whole range of media and scales, but the one thing they have in common is the English artist Nicholas Hilliard, about whom we're going to hear a lot more in a few minutes. There's that gorgeous, small, embroidered miniature portrait of Elizabeth that's on the left of the screen from a private collection. In the center, that enormous portrait of Elizabeth I, made at the request of Bess of Hardwick to hang in her home, Hardwick Hall. And then on the right, that equally extraordinary medal from the Armada Medal on loan to us from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. So thinking back to our show, Adam and I have approached this period very much as art historians, and we share the results with you upstairs in the Tisch galleries. But of course, context is all, and there is this glorious babble of Tudor voices which drift down to us from the archives. The artists themselves, the merchants, the dealers, the diplomats, even the monarchs, all those different voices, and certainly there have been generations of scholars who have devoted their professional lives to working on that material. And I think Adam would probably agree with me that we really have been standing on those gigantic shoulders when we approach this material. But nowadays, thinking of Tudor historians today, the foremost scholar, I think many people in this room would agree with me, is Dr. Elizabeth Goldring, which is why we are so absolutely thrilled that she is here in New York, and she is now going to have a conversation with Adam about this incredible period. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand over the stage to Adam and to Elizabeth. Thanks so much.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see this auditorium full with so many Tudor fans, and I'm so delighted that we all get to have this conversation with you today, Elizabeth. Those of you who have seen our catalog will know that if you flip to the bibliography, I'd say about 10% of it is Elizabeth Goldring's essential contributions to the study of Tudor art. So I'm so looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Adam. It's a real treat to be here, and huge congratulations on the exhibition. I got to see it on Tuesday, and I think it's wonderful. So if you haven't seen it yet, do enjoy it.
Thank you so much. I thought I'd start off by asking you very simply how you became fascinated by this period, which, as I've had conversations with visitors to the exhibition, connected with other scholars in the field, everybody has their origin story. That moment when they saw a portrait, visited a historic site, read a Shakespeare play. And I was just curious to know what yours might be.
I think in my case, it probably all goes back to a family holiday to England in the summer of 1984 when I was 14. And I had always loved English history and English literature. Those were always my favorite subjects at school. But I think my specific obsession with the Tudors probably dates from that holiday. I still very vividly remember visiting Hampton Court Palace and just feeling shivers down my spine at the thought that I was standing on ground that perhaps Henry VIII's feet had touched, or perhaps Elizabeth I's feet had touched. And in fact, today I still get shivers down my spine when I'm holding a manuscript that, say, has been signed by Elizabeth I. This tremendous sense of connection with the past, of almost sort of reaching through time to touch history, has never left me since that moment at Hampton Court. So I think really following that family holiday, I just became ever more obsessed with all things Tudor. As an undergraduate at Williams, I majored in English literature, but found ways to focus as much as possible on the Tudors. So whenever it was up to me to choose my classes, it was always Shakespeare, Sidney, Spenser. When I decided to become an academic and to go to graduate school, I decided not to do a PhD program in English. I decided it wasn't so much English literature that I loved, but the Tudors. And Yale had still has a wonderful program in Renaissance Studies, which is interdisciplinary. So I was able to do all things Tudor, but across the disciplines. So literature, history, art history. And though I started off thinking of myself as a literature person, by the time I got to the end of my time at Yale, I had sort of gravitated into history and then into art history.
And I think it's so striking that you have this interdisciplinary approach that really enriches your work. And one thing that visitors may be surprised to learn is that it's actually pretty rare for art history programs to focus on 16th century English art. When you study Renaissance art, most people assume you work on the Italian Renaissance, maybe you work on the Northern Renaissance, on the German-speaking lands, the Netherlands, but there are very few sort of traditionally trained art historians working on England. That's changing a little bit, but...
You're absolutely right, and certainly in the 1990s, when I was in graduate school, it was considered a little bit eccentric, at least in this country, to want to focus on Tudor art. I think the thinking at that time was, if you're interested in the Tudors, do literature or history. If you want to do English art or British art, why aren't you doing the 18th century? I think it was considered slightly eccentric, and I never would have thought in the 1990s, when I was beginning my work on Tudor art, that the Met would one day mount an exhibition like this. So it's very exciting to see the Tudors being embraced by a major museum in North America. It's really, really wonderful. England, of course, has a long tradition of mounting exhibitions that celebrate Tudor art, but I think, is this the first such exhibition on the site?
It is. And Lizzie and I often have said to each other, and as she indicated in her opening remarks, it's really because of the transformative contributions to the field, both in archival research, but also in the technical study, the understanding of how these works are made, the condition that they're in, that we were able to do this. So very much standing on the shoulders of giants, as Lizzie said. Could you tell us a little bit about your dissertation and how you combined your literary background with your engagement with the visual arts?
Sure. My PhD dissertation was on Sir Philip Sidney's treatment of painting in his poetry. And I thought that it would be interesting, by way of a little bit of background, to include some information on what sort of access he would have had in England to paintings. So in other words, I wanted to find out what sort of paintings were hanging in the Long Gallery at Penshurst Place, the Sidney family estate in Kent. What sort of paintings were hanging on the walls of other long galleries in England that Sidney might have visited. And so I thought, well, I'll spend a day or two in the library and I'll get the answers to that, and that will be sorted. But when I went to the library at Yale, I discovered that the book that would have answered those questions didn't exist. And I found just fleeting references to the fact that there did seem to be rather a lot of inventories, most of them unpublished, detailing picture collections by various Elizabethan aristocrats, including Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Queen Elizabeth I's favorite, and also by chance Sir Philip Sidney's uncle. And I didn't really have time for the purposes of my dissertation to delve too deeply into all of that, but when the time came to turn the dissertation into a book, I thought, I'll have a look at some of those inventories and just see if they're of any use. And one thing led to another. I just kept discovering more and more inventories and more information in the archives. And what began as a book version of a dissertation on Sir Philip Sidney's treatment of painting in his poetry turned into a book about the picture collection of his uncle, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, because what I discovered and did not expect to find at all was that Dudley was recognized in his own lifetime as the greatest patron of painters and collector of paintings at the Elizabethan court. But somehow, in the intervening centuries, this had been forgotten, sort of overshadowed by all of the scandals attached to Dudley's name. Dudley is the chap who wrongly was said to have thrown his first wife down a flight of stairs in order to marry Queen Elizabeth. So he was someone who attracted scandal wherever he went. And what lingered after he died was the scandal, the innuendo. And over the centuries, his amazing contribution to the history of British art was forgotten. So my first book was really an attempt to recreate his picture collection and rehabilitate his reputation, and it all really came about by chance from just following the trail in the archives, a bit like a detective piecing together clues, because alas, the inventories were not all in a single archive. They were scattered throughout archives all over the world, and it wasn't just inventories that were useful, it was also correspondence, financial accounts, all sorts of documents, but it was really good fun. It was like putting together a puzzle and seeing the pieces finally fall into place. It took me 20 years to write that book, so it took a bit of patience, but it was very gratifying in the end, very, very good fun.
And thanks to your research, Dudley is a key protagonist of our exhibition. I've just put up on the screen Zucchero's wonderful drawn portrait of him, which I'd love to discuss. But maybe before we dive into specific works in the exhibition, could you talk a little bit about the skill set that you needed to do this sleuthing in the archives? I know that's something that's very daunting to many grad students I talk to. So how did you become the kind of scholar who can make archival discoveries?
Well, fortunately, and this is really just by chance, while I was in graduate school at Yale, I did a one-semester class in paleography. I must confess that before I took the class, I wasn't quite sure what paleography meant or what it was, but it's basically the art or science of deciphering old handwriting. And it was perhaps the single most useful class I took as a graduate student, because it really does unlock the archives for you. You have some beautiful manuscripts on display in the exhibition, which have very neat handwriting, really beautiful examples of the calligraphic art. But as you and I both know, the vast majority of the manuscripts that you encounter in archives are not usually so beautifully written or so well preserved. What you tend to encounter more often than not when you go into the archives are manuscripts that have perhaps been damaged by fire or water over the centuries. Often, the edges have been nibbled at by rodents. So I always want to wash my hands after I've spent a day in the archives. Handwriting varied then as now. Some people had neater handwriting than others. You've also got to factor in the fact that spelling was not standardized at all in the 16th century, so people would just sort of have a go and write phonetically. And if they're trying to render a foreign name, it gets really complicated. So Hilliard's name appears in all sorts of ways in continental archives. And similarly, Holbein's name appears in all sorts of strange, weird and wonderful spellings when English speakers try to render his name. So there are just all sorts of complexities and challenges. Dating manuscripts, as you will know, is not straightforward. Sometimes the manuscripts are dated in terms of regnal years. So you know how long the current monarch had been on the throne at the moment that manuscript was compiled. Sometimes it's done in terms of the legal calendar. So you almost need a chart sometimes to calculate the date of the manuscript you're looking at. So nothing really happens very quickly when deciphering these manuscripts, but the payoff is often enormous because there are all sorts of riches waiting to be unearthed. I mean, we sometimes think, or at least I used to think, what more could there possibly be to say about the Tudors? So many books have been written, but the amazing and very exciting thing is when you go into the archives that there is almost always some new tidbit to be discovered. And I think that's what motivates me to keep going, because it is that sense of being on a treasure hunt and finding exciting new things.
Great. Well, let's talk about some of the discoveries you made about this fascinating figure, Robert Dudley. We see him on the screen, and strikingly, he's portrayed by an Italian artist, very exceptional within the context of our exhibition, particularly in the Elizabethan period, when the stereotype is that England becomes this isolated island nation cut off from the cultural riches of Catholic Europe. So how was it that Dudley ended up portrayed by an Italian artist, and what makes him such a fascinating patron within the Elizabethan art world?
Well, this drawing that you have on display in the exhibition and projected on the screen is an extraordinary example of cultural exchange between England and Italy in this period. We know that Dudley went to a huge amount of effort to woo Zucchero to England in 1575. Dudley had actually 10 years earlier tried to woo another Italian painter to England. This was a real obsession of his. I think he very much admired the Medici and wanted to cast himself in the model of an Italian Renaissance prince. And one way of doing that was to try to woo top-notch Italian painters to England. And having failed in 1565, Dudley was not one to give up. He kept going and eventually got Zucchero to come to England. And Zucchero not only portrayed Dudley from the life, but also portrayed Queen Elizabeth from the life. And I was able, by piecing together clues from inventories, correspondence, a variety of sources, to link those drawings, those commissions, to Dudley's picture collection at Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire, and specifically to a series of festivities that he staged at Kenilworth in 1575, when the Queen and pretty much the entire court visited for most of the month of July. And Dudley pulled out all the stops in an effort to persuade Queen Elizabeth to marry him. And this included commissioning portraits of the two of them, which we might imagine were intended to be unveiled in the course of those festivities. So it really is amazing, the ambition, the audacity of these bold gestures that were always a few steps beyond what anyone else at the Elizabethan court was attempting, and very much put paid to the conventional notion that Elizabethan England was cut off from the continent. There was so much cultural exchange, and Dudley was very much at the forefront of that.
And you've also written fascinatingly about the fact that his nephew, Sir Philip Sidney, sat for his portrait by Veronese. It's to me one of the great tragedies of Tudor art history that portrait doesn't survive, or at least hasn't been identified.
Well, exactly. I keep hoping that I'll be at a car boot sale and there it will be, and I can pick it up.
You and me both.
Yeah. I mean, chances are it doesn't survive, but you never know. I mean, this is another exciting thing. It's not just in the archives that amazing things are waiting to be discovered. It's extraordinary what is lurking in people's attics and under their beds. And, now and again, amazing paintings do just suddenly turn up on the art market. So it is, the new finds keep coming, and that is just really thrilling.
I always find, as a curator who is occasionally able to make acquisitions, sometimes it feels almost like you've manifested it. We've wanted it to be there so much, and some dealer picks up on that and discovers it. So we're going to manifest Veronese's portrait of Sir Philip Sidney. I wanted to go back to something you mentioned before, which was the festivities at Kenilworth. And you're the editor of very important records of Elizabeth's so-called progresses, which were, I would say, the motivation or the engine behind the creation of some of the most amazing Tudor art. So could you talk a little bit more about the progresses as a cultural phenomenon, and maybe this portrait in particular?
Sure. Well, most summers of her reign, Queen Elizabeth left London for a few months and, accompanied by most of the court and a huge number of servants, traveled around the countryside. This was partly just to get away from the heat, partly to give the servants in the London palaces a chance to air them out and give them a thorough cleaning, and also a chance for the Queen to connect with people in the provinces. She, on these annual summer progresses would be hosted by her courtiers, who would compete with one another to outdo each other in terms of the lavishness of the hospitality that they laid on. So sometimes courtiers would build entire new wings to their country houses just to house the queen and her ladies-in-waiting for a couple of nights. They would commission new pieces of music. They would commission plays, masks, and other dramatic entertainments, because you couldn't just have the queen sitting around being bored. You had to have all sorts of entertainments and diversions for her. So it's long been known that these summer progresses were a spur to architectural patronage, a spur to the creation of new pieces of music, new pieces of drama. But what has relatively recently become apparent is that they were also a spur to the creation of new paintings, particularly painted portraits. So the image that we see on the screen, which is known as the Ditchley portrait, almost certainly commemorates a visit that the Queen made on her summer progress of 1592 to Sir Henry Lee's country house, Ditchley, in Oxfordshire. And so, for example, you see that the map on which the Queen stands has her standing on Oxfordshire, so a little in-joke and self-referential nod to where she had visited on progress that summer. We don't know quite whether this painting would have been commissioned and executed in advance of her visit, and thus something to be unveiled in her presence as part of the festivities, or whether it would have been commissioned and executed afterwards purely in a commemorative capacity. But it must surely have something to do with that progress visit. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If the Queen comes to stay with you, that's a huge event in the history of your family, and you would want to commemorate that and want it to be something that via a painting that remains in your long gallery for generations to come is something that future generations can talk about and remember. So this is one of many examples, the Ditchley portrait. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, I think probably kick-started this tradition at Kenilworth in 1575. The occasion we talked about a few moments ago when he invited Federico Zucchero to England. He not only commissioned for that progress visit the portraits of himself and Elizabeth that Zucchero created, but also another pair of portraits from an unidentified artist or artists. So again, Dudley going that little bit further, not just a portrait of the Queen, but portraits of himself and the Queen. And clearly with him as the sort of quasi-consort, this was all around the time that he was desperately trying to persuade the Queen to marry him. So really very, very interesting. And there's quite a lot of documentary evidence to suggest that other courtiers were doing the same. I mean, once Dudley had made something fashionable, other courtiers who were ambitious tended to follow suit.
I want to go back to the particular type of document that you've done a lot of work on, which is the inventory. And that may not sound as glamorous as a novel or a play, but inventories are hugely informative for art historians. And you've actually been able to often identify works recorded in inventories with surviving work. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and also about what inventories teach us about maybe the hierarchy of different media in the Tudor art world. So we not only have a drawing of Dudley, but we also have a tapestry with his coat of arms. We have this wonderful iron box that he owned. What is your sense from the inventory about how he valued different kinds of art?
Well, I think one has to make a distinction between how the owner of a collection may have valued the objects in it and how the compilers of these documents thought about the objects. Because typically household inventories were compiled by household stewards for their own record keeping. It was really a way of keeping track of items, making sure that nothing had got lost or stolen, noting when objects are moved from one house to another, etc. Typically, the household stewards would organize, and this applies to Dudley's goods, but also pretty much any Elizabethan aristocrat's goods. Typically, the household inventories would be organized by category and would start with the most valuable categories first. So almost always plate or tapestries, which were really the high status, high value items in this period. And then you work your way down to the less valuable items. And therefore, paintings, if recorded at all, tend to be last or very nearly last, which is something important to bear in mind in terms of getting into the mindset of the Tudors, because we, of course, think of these paintings that are hanging in the wall in your exhibition as, well, they are incredibly valuable nowadays, but the Tudors tended to think about them more in terms of the value of the raw ingredients, the raw materials. So if a painting was executed on wooden panels, someone valuing it would tend to think about it in terms of exactly how much a piece of wood of that size was worth. They were less concerned with the idea of the painting as a work of art, less concerned with the idea that value derived from a painting being by a particular artist as opposed to another artist. If anything, with portraits, the value of the painting tended to be more directly linked to the status of the sitter than to the identity of the painter. I mean, that starts to change during this period, but I think for most people in Tudor England, a painting was valued in terms of who the sitter was. So a picture of the king, however crudely executed, would be considered more valuable than a picture of someone of lower status, even if perhaps more artfully painted. But in any case, it's very much tapestries and plate, goldsmiths' work that are the truly high-value items in this period.
And one thing I find so striking, which very much is aligned with what you've just said, is that we have two inventories for Henry VIII's household goods. And even though he obviously had a spectacular collection of Holbein's work, for example, there are no artist names recorded. As you've just said, an artist's identity, authorship, was not a factor in valuation, at least for these stewards, if not for a collector like Leicester. But it's so striking to me that you have written a biography of a Tudor artist, despite the fact that so often identities were not recorded. We have a copy here of a book that I heartily recommend, a beautiful piece of both scholarship and design, available, I think, even with signed copies now in the bookstore. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you shifted from working on a patron, a collector, to working on an artist, and what were some of the challenges that posed? Obviously, Hilliard was someone from a lower social station than the Earl of Leicester, let alone the Queen. So was there documentation? How did you go about finding it?
Well, I think my book on Hilliard grew directly, actually, out of the book on Dudley. Hilliard features in my book on Dudley's picture collection because Hilliard was one of the painters who benefited from Dudley's patronage. But when I was writing the Dudley book, I was aware that there were certain questions about Hilliard's life and career, particularly about the earlier periods, how he rose to fame, that didn't seem to be covered in the existing literature. And I didn't really need answers to those questions in order to write the Dudley book, but the questions lingered in the back of my mind. And so I suppose the idea came to me that perhaps I would see if I could find something new to say about Hilliard. And so I started working on a biography and went into the archives, not knowing if I would find anything new. I mean, it seemed to me that possibly the reason that not much had been said about his early years was because there was nothing to find. As you rightly say, he was from quite a modest background in Exeter and Devon. So the sort of background where you might expect that there wouldn't really be much of a documentary trail. But in any case, I was quite lucky. I did find an awful lot of information, and one of the most exciting things for me about writing this book was being able to flesh out the earlier years and to be able to show how Hilliard got from the provinces to the heart of the Tudor court. Previous biographies of Hilliard had pretty much started at the point where he has already arrived and has already found favor with Queen Elizabeth, and I was able to focus more on the early years and sort of how he got to the point of attracting the Queen's attention. And for me, I think the most exciting bit was when I was able to piece together clues from lots of different manuscript sources to recreate the moment when Hilliard first portrayed Elizabeth I from the life. I was able to show that it took place in a garden at Hampton Court Palace. All roads seem to lead back to Hampton Court for me. And within a very specific window in July 1571, it came about in response to a request from Catherine de' Medici for a miniature, just like one she had recently received from Robert Dudley, who had himself commissioned a miniature from Hilliard shortly before. We know that Catherine was delighted with the miniature that Elizabeth sent her. Alas, it does not seem to survive. But it was really exciting. It's very unusual, as you know, when working in this period, to be able, with any given episode, to answer all the journalistic questions, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And this was a fluke where there just happened to be all the necessary documentary pieces of the puzzle to do that. So that was very exciting. And I had so much fun writing the Hilliard book. In terms of challenges that a biography poses, I think where it differs perhaps from some other types of writing is that, well, obviously with any type of history or art history, you want to avoid, if at all possible, reading backwards. But I think that applies with particular force when writing a biography, that if you want to get into the mindset of the person whose story you're telling, it's particularly important to avoid imposing on the story what you know to be the ultimate outcome. I think in order to make sense of decisions made at specific moments in time, it's important to remember that the person making those decisions didn't know what was around the corner the way you as the author do. So that was something I tried to keep in mind throughout. But it is challenging. It is tricky to block out what you already know about how the story ends.
Yeah, I think avoiding that sense of inevitability is so important. And that's also something we've tried to do with our exhibition, that Henry Tudor, when he seized the throne in 1485, had no idea. He might have had the ambition, but he had no idea that he would found what would become one of the most famous English dynasties. And at that moment, England was devastated by civil war, impoverished. So much had to happen for the Tudors to become the Tudors and for Hilliard to become Hilliard. One of the many things that makes Hilliard so exceptional as a Tudor artist is that he also wrote. He wrote about his art. And am I right that you were able to consult the original manuscript of his treatise?
Yes, indeed. And as you rightly say, he wrote quite an eccentric treatise, which has also some strange autobiographical passages inserted into it, which are a great gift to the biographer. But what really emerges both from the autobiographical passages and the more conventional art treatise passages is his sense of wanting to improve not only his own lot in life, his own status, but wanting to improve the status of painting and the painter more generally in England. He was born at the tail end of Henry VIII's reign in 1547, at a time when most people in England viewed painters, even fine art painters, or what we would think of as fine art painters, as lowly manual laborers. There wasn't perhaps a huge distinction between the person who paints your portrait and the person who paints your house. By the time Hilliard dies in 1619, so well into the reign of James I, that has very much altered, and in large part due to Hilliard himself. The very fact that he wrote a learned treatise, which is full of allusions to treatises written by various continental artists, namely Alberti and Dürer, shows how ambitious he was and how keen he was to present himself in a line of descent from Alberti and Dürer. He presented himself as a gentleman. His self-portrait is very similar to the portraits that he painted of aristocratic sitters. He clearly saw social mobility as of the utmost importance, and thanks to him, really the status of painting and the painter in England were transformed within a couple of generations.
What's so fascinating to me about the works by Hilliard that we have in the show is the way that, on the one hand, you see his training as a goldsmith, that he is thinking about the miniature as a kind of jewel, as something that is embellished or encrusted, like the wonderful Heneage jewel that we have on display here. And then at the same time, he's clearly looking, as you said, he's reading continental treatises and looking at prints, at images made by European artists. And we have these two cabinet miniatures where he's really pushing the limits of the miniature. I don't even know if it's proper to call them miniatures. Of course, in terms of technique they are, but they really have an incredible ambition that you don't see in miniatures prior to him.
Absolutely. So the cabinet miniatures that you see on the screen at the moment are about the size of a paperback book, would you say? That's, you know, an okay analogy, whereas the conventional miniature is round or oval and about the size of a modern watch face, I think is a fair analogy. But Hilliard, as you say, was forever pushing the envelope. I think one of the keys to his longevity, because he worked consistently for about 50 years with royal and aristocratic patronage and never really went out of, his work never really went out of fashion. But I think a key to that success was his constant willingness to innovate. So he was always inventing new riffs on the miniature. And so these cabinet miniatures, which really kind of come out of nowhere. No one else had really done anything like this. And Hilliard suddenly got the idea in the mid-1580s to apply, well, basically to try to recreate what you might think of as the conventions of large-scale oil painting, but to do it in watercolor on vellum on a much, much smaller scale. We don't know exactly how cabinet miniatures were displayed and experienced by Elizabethans, but unlike ordinary miniatures, which were often, as you were saying, encased in bejeweled settings and worn, presumably cabinet miniatures were either hung on the wall or perhaps placed in special display cases. But it turned out to be a short-lived vogue, because by the late 1590s, Hilliard has moved on and doesn't really do cabinet miniatures anymore, but he was constantly experimenting, constantly inventing, and, you know, no doubt very aware that each generation coming up at court wanted new things, and people didn't necessarily want to be portrayed as their parents' generation had been portrayed. So he was very savvy in that respect.
On the subject of his innovation and the variety of his work, we have this very large, not at all miniature, portrait oil on canvas that we've displayed as attributed to his workshop. And there have been headlines in recent years about new attributions of full-scale oil on canvas paintings to Hilliard. Were you able to discover anything, or what is your sort of thinking about his activity in that area?
It's such an interesting question. People have known for years that Hilliard did some work in grate, in oils, because there are fleeting documentary references to him having worked in oils. But it is only relatively recently that a small number of paintings have been identified as probably by Hilliard and or his workshop. And this is one of them. The face on the Queen is a pretty youthful-looking face, even though this is painted at the very end of her reign, and at a time when we know that she was in very poor health and had lost her teeth and had lots and lots of wrinkles and, well, all the signs of aging. But he has given her, or whoever has painted this has given her a very youthful face, which conforms very closely to something which Hilliard had devised for use in miniatures of the Queen towards the end of her life, which, just for convenience, art historians have dubbed the Mask of Youth. And so this is an interesting application, it seems, of a facial template originally created for use in miniature to a much larger template. If you've seen this painting in the exhibition, it is enormous. You know, raises all sorts of very interesting questions about the extent to which Hilliard and his workshop were producing paintings in oils. One of the discoveries that I made when I was working on my Hilliard book was to show that in the 1570s, so about 20 years before this picture was painted, when Hilliard spent some time in Paris, he collaborated with a Flemish painter called Joris van Stretten. It would appear on some paintings in grate. But I think there's still a lot more to be discovered about his work in larger formats, the extent to which his workshop was producing oil paintings in grate. But I suspect, because Hilliard was always hard up for cash, that if there was a market for oil paintings in grate by him in his workshop, he would have met that need. He, in spite of the fact that he enjoyed patronage at the highest levels for 50 years or so, he was always on the verge of bankruptcy and forever borrowing money from friends and family and failing to repay it and being sued. And he got into all sorts of scrapes. So I'm sure he would have turned his hand to anything that would have generated income.
It's so striking, I know, from my own work on Van Dyck. So often when you have a paper trail for an artist, it's when other people are unhappy with that artist, when there's a lawsuit, when there's a debt. So maybe we get a skewed perception of these historic individuals because we mostly read the complaints about them.
It's so true, but the legal trail that Hilliard's misfortunes left proved to be so illuminating. I mean, you were asking earlier about the types of manuscripts that are helpful to art historians, and inventories and wills and letters are the things that perhaps spring to mind first. But in Hilliard's case, you know, the many depositions and interrogatories and witness statements proved to be a gold mine. I mean, on the one hand, you have to, of course, bear in mind that the people making these statements tend to be very disgruntled individuals, but often there is a passing comment that proves incredibly revealing. So, for example, one of these legal documents just happened to mention that Hilliard was in the habit of accompanying Queen Elizabeth and her court on their summer progresses, which makes a lot of sense if you think about a painter working in an age long before the invention of electricity. There's not a lot of light in the winter months in England. You would want in the summer to be with your client base and take advantage of the long summery days and try to get as much of your work done during those months as you could. It would be a very smart move to accompany the court on progress.
Wonderful. I see we are almost out of time, but I did hope that you might be willing to talk with us a little bit about your current research without giving away any secrets. But as Mariana mentioned, you are now writing a study of Holbein, moving a little earlier in the 16th century. Is there anything you can tell us to whet our appetites for that project?
Well, I'm hoping to do something similar with Holbein to what I did with Hilliard, which is to say to write a biography that brings together the art and the life and puts it in a broad historical and cultural context. As far as the Tudor period of Holbein's life goes, I'm hoping to be able to shed a bit more light on his relationships with some of his key patrons like Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and of course Henry VIII himself. Perhaps to be able to shed a bit more light on his day-to-day life in London. It would be wonderful, for example, to be able to identify the location of his London workshop, something that has always been something people have wondered about. So it's early days. Watch this space, but the hope is that it might come out in 2026, which would mark the 500th anniversary of Holbein's arrival in England.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to pre-order it and to dive in. On that note, I can't help noting that we do have many paintings by both Holbein and Hilliard upstairs, and the museum is open, I believe, for another hour and a half, as is the gift shop, which is now fully stocked with your wonderful book, autographed. So with that, I would like to thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Elizabeth, so much for crossing the Atlantic to share your insights with us.
Thank you, Adam.